On the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, there is a mountain called Hermon. It rises over 9,000 feet above the surrounding valleys, and in winter, its summit is buried under snow that you can see from 100 miles away. The peak is real. You can drive to its base. You can hike its lower slopes. Shepherds graze their flocks on the foothills today, just as they did 3,000 years ago. And according to a book that was once read in synagogues, quoted by the apostles and revered by the earliest Christians, this mountain is where 200 angels descended from heaven, swore a mutual oath of rebellion, and began the corruption of the human race. The book is called First Enoch. It names the angels. It lists their leaders. It catalogs, in unsettling detail, the forbidden knowledge they taught humanity. And for over 1,400 years, the Western Church did everything it could to make sure you would never read it. This is the story of the book they removed, the names of the angels who fell, and what they taught us before the flood came to wipe their children from the earth. Let's begin. Before we go any further, you need to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is, because most people have never heard of it, and the few who have usually have it wrong. First Enoch is a Jewish religious text, written in stages between roughly the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after. It is named after Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, a figure mentioned only briefly in the book of Genesis. Genesis tells us that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. That is essentially all the Hebrew Bible says about him, a handful of verses. A man who did not die in the ordinary sense, but was simply taken. But somewhere in the centuries before Christ, Jewish scribes began producing a much larger body of writing attributed to this figure. They imagined what he had seen during his time with God. They filled in the silences of Genesis. And what they produced became one of the most influential religious texts of the ancient world. We know it was influential because we can see its fingerprints everywhere. The early rabbis argued about it. The community at Qumran, the people who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves above the Judean wilderness, treasured it so deeply that fragments of First Enoch in the original Aramaic were found preserved among their manuscripts. 11 separate copies were identified at Qumran alone, more than they kept of some books that did make it into the Hebrew Bible. And here is the part that most modern Christians find genuinely shocking. The New Testament quotes the Book of Enoch directly. In the Epistle of Jude, in the 14th and 15th verses, the author writes that Enoch prophesied about the coming of the Lord with 10,000s of his holy ones. That passage is not from Genesis. It is not from any book in the Hebrew Bible. It is a near verbatim quotation of 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. The brother of Jesus, writing to the early church, treated the Book of Enoch as scripture worth quoting word for word. So how did a book quoted by the New Testament end up cut from nearly every Bible on earth? We will get to that. But first, you need to know what the book actually says, because the part the early church found most difficult is also the part that gives this video its title. It is the story they call the Book of the Watchers. The narrative begins in chapter 6 of 1 Enoch. The text opens with a simple, almost casual line. In those days, when the children of men had multiplied, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. These angels are not random figures. The text gives them a specific name. In Aramaic, they are called the Iron. In Greek, the Egregoroi. In English, the Watchers. They are a class of high-ranking angels whose original purpose was to watch over the affairs of the earth without interfering. They were observers, guardians, cosmic supervisors. And on this day, on the slopes of a specific mountain in the Levant, 200 of them decided to abandon that role. Their leader was an angel named Shemi-Hazah, and according to the text, he was afraid. Not afraid of God exactly, but afraid of acting alone. He knew that what they were about to do was a transgression that would bring punishment, and he did not want to bear that punishment by himself. So he gathered the 200 together on the summit of Mount Hermon, and he addressed them with a speech the text preserves almost in full. "I fear," Shemihaza said, "that you will not actually carry out this deed, and I alone shall pay the penalty for a great sin." So he made them all swear an oath. Each angel placed himself under a curse, binding his fate to the others. None of them would back out. All of them would share the guilt. The text tells us they bound themselves by mutual imprecations, so calling down destruction upon their own heads if any one of them broke ranks. 200 immortal beings, standing in a circle on a snow-covered peak, cursing themselves into a single conspiracy. Now, here is a detail that most translations preserve, but most readers miss. The name Hermon, in Hebrew, shares a root with the word harem, which means a curse, a ban, or something dedicated to destruction. The mountain of the oath becomes, in the language of the text, the mountain of the curse. The pun is deliberate. The author is telling you, through the name of the place itself, that what happened on this peak doomed everyone who participated. The mountain remembered, and then the text does something remarkable. It names them. 1 Enoch, chapter 6, verse 7, gives us a list of 20 chiefs, the leaders of the 200. The full list is preserved in both the Greek and Ethiopic manuscripts, and it has been confirmed by the Aramaic fragments found at Qumran. The names are strange, beautiful, specific, and almost every one of them carries a meaning tied to what that angel would later teach humanity. The leader, as we have said, was Shemihaza. His name means, roughly, the name has seen, and he is the organizer of the descent. Beneath him stood his most dangerous lieutenant, an angel called Asael, whose name appears in some manuscripts as Azazel. Asael is the figure the text holds most responsible for what came next, and we will return to him in a moment. Then there is Barakel, whose name in Aramaic literally means lightning of God, and who taught humanity to read the signs of the lightning. Kokabel, whose name means star of God, taught the constellations and the patterns of the night sky. Sariel taught the courses of the moon, the lunar calendar, the timing of eclipses. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments, what we would today call counter-magic, the breaking of spells. The list continues. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Sahriel was associated with the moon as well. Tamiel taught dark and hidden things. Ramiel, whose name means thunder of God, was tied to visions and dreams. Daniel, distinct from the prophet, appears among the chiefs. Then Yomyael, Hermoni, Matarel, Ananel, Setuel, Turel, Yamayol. 20 in total, each one a leader of 10, each one tied to a specific corruption of human knowledge that was about to enter the world. But there is one more name on this list that deserves its own moment, and we will come back to him at the end of this section, because what he taught humanity is the part of the story that most people find hardest to accept. His name is Penemu. Now, with the Watchers named and bound by their oath, the text turns to what they actually did. And this is where the Book of Enoch stops being a story about angels and becomes something else entirely. It becomes an indictment of civilization itself. The teachings of the Watchers, as catalogued across chapters 7 and 8 of 1 Enoch, fall into 3 broad categories. And the text frames every single one of them not as a gift, but as a corruption, a wound in the world that could not be closed. The first category is weapons and warfare, and it is associated almost entirely with the angel Asael. Before Asael descended, the text implies humans did not know how to make weapons. They lived as hunters and farmers. They had stone tools. They had wooden spears. But they did not know how to mine ore from the earth. They did not know how to smelt copper or alloy it with tin to make bronze. They did not know how to extract iron from rock and beat it into a blade that would hold an edge. According to 1 Enoch chapter 8, Asael taught all of this. He taught them to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught them the arts of metallurgy in their entirety. He showed them how to extract bronze and silver and gold from the rocks. And he showed them how to turn those metals into instruments of killing. Yet the text describes him standing over the first forge, teaching the first smiths how to fold the hot metal, how to quench it in water, how to sharpen the edge against a stone. The text is unambiguous about what this meant. From Asael, the cry of the dying began to rise from the earth. Because before his teaching, humans had no efficient means of slaughtering one another. A man with a stone could kill another man, but a man with a bronze sword could kill 10. A man with armor could kill 100. The invention of organized warfare in this telling is not a human achievement. It is a fallen angel's gift. The first battles, the first conquests, the first cities burned to the ground, all of them trace back to a single instructor on a single mountain. The second category is harder to translate cleanly into a modern frame because it deals with cosmetics, ornamentation, and what the text calls the beautifying of the eyelids. Asael, again, is named as the teacher. He showed women how to make bracelets and ornaments. He taught the use of antimony, a mineral that ancient peoples ground into a black powder and applied around the eyes, the same compound that produced the famous painted eyes of Egyptian art. He taught the dyeing of fabrics in deep, costly colors, the purples and crimsons that would later mark out kings. He taught the cutting and polishing of precious stones and how to set them in gold. To a modern reader, this list sounds almost trivial. Eye makeup, jewelry, dyed cloth. Why would these things be classed alongside weapons of war? The answer is that the text is not condemning ornament for its own sake. It is condemning the use of beauty as manipulation. The framing in chapter 8 is explicit. These teachings, the text says, led to fornication, and the world was corrupted. The Watchers had taught women to weaponize their appearance, and the result, in the moral universe of 1 Enoch, was a kind of social collapse, where desire and deception became inseparable. Marriage, family, the bonds that held human communities together, all of it was undermined by the introduction of an art form whose only purpose was to inflame. You may agree with that framing, or you may not, but it is what the text says. The third category is the one modern readers find most fascinating. It is the category of forbidden sciences. Barakel, the lightning angel, taught humans to read meaning in the flashes of the sky. Kokabel taught them to read meaning in the patterns of the stars. Sariel taught them the cycles of the moon, the months, the seasons, the festivals. Together, these three angels are blamed for the entire enterprise of astrology, the belief that human destiny can be read in the heavens. The horoscope in this telling is a fallen angel inheritance. Other Watchers taught what the text calls the cutting of roots, which scholars understand as a reference to herbalism and pharmacology, the use of plants to alter the human body. Sleeping drafts, poisons, medicines that could kill or cure depending on the dose. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments, the breaking of spells, the unraveling of curses laid by other practitioners. The text presents all of this as occult knowledge, knowledge that humans were not supposed to possess, leaked into the world by beings who had no right to share it. And then we come to Penemu. Penemu's teaching is described in a later section of 1 Enoch in chapter 69, and it is the most striking accusation in the entire book. Penemu, the text says, taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet, and he taught them the secrets of wisdom. He taught them to write with ink and paper, And through this many have gone astray from eternity to eternity, even to this day. For men were not created for such a purpose, that they should give confirmation to their good faith with pen and ink. Read that again, slowly, because the implication is staggering. The Book of Enoch frames literacy itself, the act of writing things down as a fallen angel's transgression. The argument seems to be that before writing, human relationships were governed by the spoken word, by personal honor, by the witnessed oath. A man's promise was bound to his face, his voice, the people who had heard him speak. After writing, those relationships were governed by contracts, by records, by ink that could be manipulated and forged and altered after the fact. Penemu gave humans the power to lie permanently, to inscribe falsehood into the world in a form that would outlive the liar. A book written in ink on paper is telling you that the invention of ink and paper was a curse. The Watchers taught all of these things. And then, inevitably, the text turns to what their presence on earth produced: their children. The angels did not only teach, they took human wives. And from those unions, according to 1 Enoch chapter 7, came the giants. The Hebrew word is Nephilim, the same word that appears in that famously cryptic passage in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, where the text mentions, almost in passing, that the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. Genesis gives that story 2 sentences. 1 Enoch gives it chapters. And the giants of 1 Enoch are not the heroic warriors of later legend. They are monsters. The text describes them as enormous in size, 3,000 cubits in some manuscripts, which is a number meant to convey horror rather than literal measurement. Their appetite was the central problem. They consumed all the food that the humans could produce. The harvests of entire villages disappeared into single meals. Granaries emptied in days. When the food ran out, the text says, the giants turned to the animals. They devoured the livestock, the wild herds, the birds. When the animals were exhausted, they turned on each other. Brother fought brother. The earth ran with their blood, and eventually, when even that was not enough, they turned on the humans who had birthed them. They began to drink human blood. They began to eat human flesh. The earth itself, the text says, cried out, not metaphorically. The ground gave voice to the suffering it had witnessed, and the cry rose up through the heavens. In heaven, the 4 great archangels heard it. They are named in chapter 9. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel. The 4 pillars of the celestial court, the highest-ranking angels in the divine hierarchy, looked down from their stations and saw what had happened on the earth, and they brought the case before God. The judgment came in 2 stages. The Watchers themselves were to be bound. Raphael was sent to seize Asael, the worst of the offenders, the teacher of weapons and cosmetics. Raphael was instructed to bind him hand and foot, and to cast him into a place of darkness in the desert called Dudael, where he would remain in jagged rocks under a covering of sharp stones, in absolute darkness, until the day of the great judgment. Michael was sent to bind Shemihaza and his companions beneath the hills of the earth, where they would lie in chains for 70 generations, watching as their own children destroyed each other above them, awaiting the same final reckoning. And the giants, their children, were to be destroyed. The flood that comes in Genesis, the flood of Noah, is in 1 Enoch a targeted weapon. It is not primarily about human wickedness in the abstract. It is about wiping the bloodline of the Watchers off the face of the earth. The waters rose to drown a specific contamination. That is the story. 200 angels, 20 named leaders, a catalog of forbidden teachings, monstrous children, a cry from the earth, 4 archangels, a binding, a flood. And it was, for a long stretch of antiquity, considered scripture. So what happened? This is the part of the story that conspiracy videos love to dramatize, and most of what they say is wrong. There was no midnight order to burn the Book of Enoch. There was no decree from a single council that erased it from history. The truth is messier, slower, and in some ways more interesting. The book began to fall out of favor in Jewish circles after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era. The rabbis who rebuilt Judaism in the centuries that followed grew increasingly suspicious of pseudepigrapha, texts attributed to ancient figures that were clearly written much later. First Enoch was one of these. The story it told, with its named angels and its detailed cosmology, sat uneasily with the more austere theology the rabbis were developing. By the time the rabbinic canon stabilized, Enoch had been quietly left outside of it. In Christianity, the process took longer and involved specific named figures, locked in genuine intellectual conflict. In the early 3rd century, the North African theologian Tertullian still defended the book with vigor. In his treatise On the Apparel of Women, he argued explicitly that the Book of Enoch was authentic scripture. His reasoning was clever. He pointed out that the book was quoted by Jude in the New Testament, and he asked, rhetorically, whether anyone who accepted Jude could reject the source Jude himself had treated as authoritative. To Tertullian, the case was closed. But Tertullian lost the argument. By the 4th century, the tide had turned decisively. Augustine of Hippo, the most influential theologian in the history of Western Christianity, took up the question in his enormous work, The City of God, in Book 15, Chapter 23. Augustine acknowledged that Enoch had genuinely existed and had genuinely written something. But he argued that the book circulating under Enoch's name could not be verified, that its antiquity was suspect, and that its content sat uneasily with mainstream Christian theology. He worried, in particular, about the literal reading of angels mating with women. He preferred to interpret the sons of God in Genesis as the descendants of Seth, the righteous human line, rather than as fallen celestial beings. Augustine's view became the dominant view. And then, in the year 367, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, sent out his 39th festal letter. This letter is one of the most important documents in the history of the Christian Bible, because it lists, for the first time, the 27 books of the New Testament that we use today. And in defining what was inside, Athanasius also, by implication, defined what was outside. The Book of Enoch was outside. From that point onward, in the Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking churches of the Mediterranean, First Enoch slowly faded. It was not actively destroyed. It simply stopped being copied. And in a manuscript culture, a book that stops being copied disappears within a few generations. The parchment rots. The ink fades. The monastic libraries lose interest in maintaining a text no one is supposed to read anymore. By the medieval period, the Book of Enoch was effectively lost to Western Christianity. Scholars knew it had once existed because they could read references to it in older writers. They knew Jude had quoted it. They could see its shadow in the writings of the Church Fathers. But the text itself was gone. For over 1,000 years, no one in Europe could open a copy and read what it actually said, except in one place. Far to the south, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, a Christian kingdom had developed in almost total isolation from the theological debates of Rome and Constantinople. Ethiopian Christianity had received its scriptures early, in the 4th and 5th centuries, before the canon decisions of the Mediterranean Church had fully solidified. And among the books that Ethiopian Christians had received and translated into their classical liturgical language, called Ge'ez, was the complete Book of Enoch. They never stopped copying it. While Augustine was arguing against it, while Athanasius was leaving it off his list, while the Latin West was forgetting it ever existed, monks in mountain monasteries in Ethiopia were copying the Book of Enoch by hand, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. And they believed it was scripture. Their ancestors had believed it was scripture, and no council in a distant land was going to convince them otherwise. And then, in 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce arrived in Gondar, the imperial capital of Ethiopia. Bruce had spent years searching for the source of the Blue Nile. And along the way, he had become deeply curious about the religious manuscripts of the Ethiopian church. When he heard that the local Christians possessed a complete Book of Enoch, the same book that had been lost to Europe for over 1,000 years, he was, by his own account, astonished. He acquired 3 manuscript copies. He carried them back across the deserts of Sudan and Egypt and across the Mediterranean to Europe. And he placed one of them in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, where it sat largely ignored for nearly 50 years before an English clergyman named Richard Lawrence finally translated it into English in 1821. The reaction in Europe was, predictably, enormous. A book quoted by Jude, a book referenced by the early church fathers, a book that explained the cryptic passage in Genesis about the sons of God and the daughters of men, had returned. The definitive English edition was produced in 1912 by the Oxford scholar R.H. Charles, and it remains, with revisions, the standard text used today. And then came the final confirmation. Between 1947 and 1956, in the caves above the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran, archaeologists discovered the manuscripts that became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the fragments were copies of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, the original language in which much of it had been composed. These fragments dated to the 2nd century before Christ, which means the Book of Enoch is, in some of its sections, older than most of the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible itself. It is genuinely, verifiably ancient. It is genuinely quoted in the New Testament. It was genuinely read by the earliest Christians. And it survived to the modern world because of a geographical accident. A church in the Ethiopian highlands, isolated from the councils and arguments of the Mediterranean, kept reading a book that everyone else had forgotten. The Watchers were named. Their teachings were catalogued. Their punishment was recorded. And for over 1,400 years, in most of the Christian world, almost no one knew. You can read it now. Any complete English translation will give you the names, the descent, the teachings, the giants, and the binding, exactly as the Aramaic and Greek. And Guy's manuscripts have preserved them. What you do with it is up to you.